Now it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome Dr. Janine Pease. She is a gift to our state and a gift to our country in that she's spent the last 50 years of her professional career contributing to tribal higher education and the Crow language revitalization. Her undergraduate degrees are in sociology and anthropology from Central Washington University, and advanced degrees in higher education from Montana State University in Bozeman. Dr. Pease is the founding president of the Little Bighorn College of the Crow Nation. She's cabinet head of the Education for the Crow, also board chair for the Crow Language Consortium. Dr. Pease has received countless awards, sat on state and national boards, and we're so grateful for her presence today.
Greetings to all of you. I'm so glad to see each and every one of you here. It's good to share this time today. My name is one who loves to pray. I am an Apsaloka woman from Lodgegrass, Montana. I have a personal stake in this story, as does nearly every Native person in Montana, because they descend from someone who spent time in a boarding school. My own grandfather and grandmother went to boarding school at Crow Agency. My grandfather and his brothers, 4 of them, went all the way to Riverside, California, to the school there. Now I can't recall what's the matter. I can't remember the name of it. Sherman Indian School, sorry, to be a bit slow. By the same token, yes, we have descendancy, and a lot of families are very, very proud of that connection. But there's also as much loss and tragedy. My own grandfather's younger brother went to boarding school at Crow Agency, and through some series of illness or perhaps undue punishment, he came back to the family without life. We lost little Benny, and it's always been a source of interest and sadness. Even as a little girl, we decorated his grave and it said Little Benny, and I just thought of that little person not having the chance to, live. And my grandpa lived with us most of his life, and he always spoke so affectionately of his little brother. He'd never actually call him by his name. Well, I am very interested as an educator in the lives of children in schools. And knowing the story of boarding schools or schools altogether for the Crow Indians has been, you might say, as you all are historians, one of those fevers you can't get over. It just keeps grabbing you, and it just engages you, it seems like, forever. So this is a presentation about where my curiosity led, about the Crow students who went to Carlisle, because many of our families do have ancestors who spent years there at Carlisle. And this first slide is just pictures of the various buildings. Now, this is not a building history, this is a person history, but I think having a sense of place is important. It's in Pennsylvania. And I'm calling my presentation Carlisle Indian Industrial School and the Crow Indian Students, a Bittersweet Legacy, 1883 to 1918. Now, that doesn't really match the years that Carlisle was open, and I'll tell you why. I've had plenty of assistance from our librarian and archivist at Little Bighorn College, as well as historians Fred Hoxie and Mardell Plainfeather, and Rodney Thomas, and Jim Gerenser is the archivist at Dickinson College, where the collection of Carlisle archival collection exists. Now, you might have a question, where are all these schools called boarding schools? There are what might be a small blizzard on this map of the United States. And recently, the final report from the Secretary of Interior was issued about boarding schools. So it says from 1819 to 1969, the federal Indian boarding school systems consisted of 408 schools across 37 states, 21 in Alaska, and 7 in Hawaii. These schools met a criteria. They had to have housing, overnight lodging. They provided academic and vocational training. They were described in records as receiving federal government funds or support, and they were operational before 1969. Now, this report is online. All 400 pages, you can find it. Just put in the same name of the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland. It'll come right up. And in Montana, there are 19 boarding schools, which includes religious schools, Catholic, certainly where the Ursuline sisters served, but also federal. And we're looking at, oh, I'll see if I can use my pointer. Here we are in Great Falls. And you know from our previous speaker, thank you, Christy, that there were 2 boarding schools right near here that served children from the tribes in the, especially in this area, Fort Shaw and St. Mary's. So the federal boarding system employed systematic militarized and identity alteration methodologies. Now, this is directly from this final report. And this report is probably the most fact-based, close to truth report that we have available to us. And it's just hot off the press, July 30th, just a couple of months ago. This was in an attempt to assimilate Indian children through education to include. Now, I want to call your attention to the term assimilate. You know, we say, oh, just assimilate. But we're talking about children who not only could not speak the language, they couldn't hear the language they knew. They didn't know anyone. That's way beyond assimilation. It's like personal prison. You know, my own father went to a public school in Lodgegrass, and he said, because he spoke Crow language exclusively, it took him 3 years to figure out what was going on. He flunked first grade 3 times. You imagine the isolation and the humiliation of it all. But I just have to say that every time I read the word assimilation, I just think, how could they use such a tame, you know, almost innocuous word for something so damaging, injuring, and really warlike? I always imagine a child as having like tape across their ears, over their mouth, across their eyes, and then see what you can do, and then be punished for it. Okay, so in this report, it says they renamed children, which they did. Most of the boarding schools renamed children, giving them very anonymous names like Mary, 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 Thomas, 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 Thomas. So renaming. And anyone's identity begins with our name, doesn't it? Cutting their hair, which is a symbol of personal power and connection to ancestors and spiritual beliefs. They were discouraged and prevented the use of American Indian languages, religions, and cultural practices. Now let's just look at the term cultural practices for just a minute. And think of a child humming about something, humming a tune, singing a lullaby, the lullaby their mom sung to them when they were a baby. You don't get to do that. Let's talk about children playing games in the prairies. You know, the people playing the plum pit game or hand game. You don't get to do that. You don't get to play your games, sing your songs, have your images, none of that. Don't get to pray in your own language. None of that. How much can be taken? Just everything when you say cultural practices and religions, beliefs, and values. And the children were organized into units to perform military drills. My grandpa said that they were formed in a platoon, and they marched from the dorm to the cafeteria. And then they marched back from the cafeteria to the dorm to change for school, and then they marched to the schoolroom. Everything was in marching formation. It was a 3-tiered system, but we're here today to talk about the off reservation boarding schools. Every reservation had their local boarding schools. And in spite of the fact that they were like across the street from the encampment that was around the school, some children went there for 5 years, some 7, and never were allowed to see their parents or their relatives. But off-reservation boarding schools is what we're going to be talking about. And this is an education mainly for what we might find to be sort of equivalent to grade 7 and up. The off-reservation boarding schools took up where the local boarding schools left off. Now, the U.S. government in 1819 established the Civilization Fund to introduce among them habits and arts of civilization. That's another word that is ignites a fire in me. Let's be civilized, you know. And this fund is for the civilization of American Indians, and to authorize the president to employ capable persons of good moral character to instruct such Indians in the mode of agriculture suited to their situation, and for teaching their children in reading, writing, and arithmetic, and performing other duties as may be enjoined. Now, there's a lot of concern about what's going on about American Indians. Of course, this is, we step into the off-reservation school story just as all the wars are coming to a close. Little Bighorn was fought in 1876, and you know, there's all these different incredible wars and massacres. Most of the American Indian people are now forcibly or some semi-peaceably settled onto reservations. So now what to do with the Indian problem? That's the big question. What's next? Well, there's a lot of people talking about this. There's a huge number of organizations in the East, and this is just to name a few, but they come into conversation with the U.S. government. What to do? The Indian Rights Association, they're interested to secure civilization for American Indians. That was kind of their main thrust. The Board of Indian Commissioners helped the Commissioner of Indian Affairs look at what delivering grants peace policy. The Boston Indian Citizenship Association focused on they were furious over Indian removal, removing one tribe to another place and so on. That was their main issue, and they sought recognition of treaty rights and citizenship. Now, yes, there's certain advocacy, human rights kinds of concerns and so on, all of them sort of taking a different angle into this discussion. The Women's Nation Indian Association, women from Philadelphia, were concerned with and devoted to the cause of Indian uplift and assimilation. And they met every year for 30 years, starting at about I've got the year, I think it's in 1890, for 30 years to talk about this Indian problem. Of course, that's kind of a long way from Indian country, and I'm going to be willing to bet almost none of them, not probably any of them, were Native people. So what are the aims of Indian education as we step into this? Well, they were convinced that schools were the ultimate solution to the Indian problem, now that the wars were essentially over. Convinced that schools were the ultimate solution to the Indian problem, policymakers tuned to the question of what are the aims? First, to provide the Indian child with the rudiments of an academic education, the civilized branches of knowledge, and to speak the English language, liberating the child from the mind-dulling weight of tribal tradition. Second, Indians needed to be individualized. They ran around in a group too much. They were far too communal. Individualized, to teach the Indian boy to till the soil, shove the plane, and the Indian girl to do the work of a good and skillful housewife. They must be inculcated with the values and beliefs of possessive individualism. Really some loaded terms there. Now, these are the published, statements of these people that met those 30 years, but somewhat early in that 30 years. Third, to reconstruct indigenous conceptions of home and family, the conversion of Native societies to the ideal of the patriarchal nuclear family. Now think just how severely different absolutely worlds apart from matriarchal societies, extended families, clan, and band. How far away that value, there's another word that's just so lightly used, but the value is so heavy and so amazingly injurious. And the fourth one was Christianization. Packing all these together, remember, we're not just selecting one or the other. They're all, woven in together, embracing the entire ethical code, the principle that an individual was responsible for both economic and spiritual self. Economics gets stirred in there as well. Fifth, citizenship training to prepare Indian youth for assimilation into the national life, for duties and privileges. Hard to find privileges in here, in this story, but the privileges of American citizenship, devotion to nation and flag. And this comes from Education for Extinction, American Indians and the Boarding School Experience, written by David Wallace Adams. Now, Merrill Gates was the president of that Mohawk conference that met every year for 30 years. And I'm sorry, that should be 1881, not 1981. Those are my fingers, not doing me well. With the Indian Wars over, now this is Merrill Gates, he says, the war against Indians had now entered a new phase. Conquering a continent and its Aboriginal peoples had been a bloody business. And for a Christian people, not without moral discomfort. Now the war against savagism would be waged in a gentler fashion. The next Indian War would be ideological and psychological, and it would be waged against Indian children. The army of Christian school teachers was going to win that victory. We are going to conquer barbarism, but we are going to do it by getting at the barbarism one by one, meaning one child by one child. An army of teachers armed with ideas, winning victories by industrial training and by the gospel of love and work. Boy, when you read this, doesn't it just get a mantle that's so heavy you just can't move? It is, it's overwhelming. Well, now you need to meet Captain Pratt. Now, he is a person that is a Civil War veteran. He finds himself after the Civil War out in the Southwest, assigned to duty having to do with dealing with the warriors from the last of the Indian Wars. Captain Pratt, you see him on his steed on the left in his uniform, very formally posing. And so Captain Pratt spent, he founded the first of the off-reservation Native American boarding schools. That's Carlisle. Okay, so you're going to get some background on Captain Pratt here. Captain Pratt was assigned to go with a prisoner group from Kiowas, Comanches, Cheyennes, Apaches, and one Caddo Indian to Fort Marion, Florida, where they were all being held prisoners. And he was their overseer in Fort Marion in Florida. In a makeshift fortress, the men learned how they were sitting around, and he managed to find volunteers from a neighboring group of ladies to come in and tutor them. And lo and behold, they learned to read. They learned to write, and they were intelligible. He shocked himself, really, in a lot of ways, to find out that these prisoners had that potential. And he concluded from that experience, because in just a matter of months, there was literacy, and they were talking, and they could present, they could do theater, and there were just all kinds of things that they could do. He concluded that education was indeed the solution to the Indian problem. And not in any time at all, he took a group of those, he got permission to take a group of those prisoners to Hampton Institute, which was an institute for the children of freed slaves, Hampton Institute. And then after they had been there a year, he didn't really like it. He didn't really want the Indians that he brought mixing in with the African-American children. And they did have a wing that was reserved entirely for American Indians. There were also already some Indians there. My own great-grandmother went to Hampton Institute. She was in that wing, maybe even, probably when those prisoners were there. Her name was Sarah Walker. Anyway, he made a request to the Congress. He requested to start his own school for Indians at $1,200 per student for 8 years of education, very much less costly than waging war, he said to the Congress. So we see this picture again of the number of children, that annual photograph of all the children that attended Carlisle, oldest in the back, youngest in. You can see that there indeed are some very young children in that very front row. It's quite awesome, but you know, in terms of the purpose or the aim of individualism, you remember that. Is there anything individual about the way in which the uniforms are slapped on each of these children and the way in which they conduct their lives? No, you don't get to think for yourself. I mean, it's crazy. It's oxymoronic, isn't it? I've always wanted to use that word. I think that's a good word. If I had had a chance to talk to Captain Pratt, I would have said, you know what? I think it doesn't work. Anyway, so now there's a book, if you're interested in being the student of off-reservation boarding schools, called Carlisle Indian Industrial School, Indigenous Histories, Memories, and Reclamations. And it's written by Jacqueline Fear-Segal and Susan Rose, who live right at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. They study everything. They're amazing scholars. So the Indian children traveled at least 1,000 miles by river and rail to Carlisle. Captain Pratt determined to remove the native children as far as possible from their families and their communities and strip them of all of their traditional cultures and instruct them in the language, religions, behavior, and skills of mainstream white society. Carlisle was the first off-reservation Indian boarding school, really the blueprint for a whole series of schools. 24 in all would be organized in the next 5 to 10 years. And this is the map. You can imagine being from Montana, thinking of way off Pennsylvania, and leaving for the school was probably a very painful affair. Joe Medicine Crow, who is one of our tribal historians, passed away now. I'm sure you've all heard of Joe Medicine Crow, decorated World War II veteran, but a historian. He said that one day at Crow boarding school, some of the older children were told to go from their classroom and go to their dorm and pack up all their things. And there were about 8 or 10 of them. And then they were marched to the railroad station, which is like 2.5 blocks from the school, right in Crow Agency, because the railroad just goes right through town there in Crow Agency. And they were waiting on the platform, and there was a big cry that went out in the village there. They're taking children somewhere. Meanwhile, the train pulls in and those children were loaded up. They were sent to Carlisle. Parents not informed, not gotten permission, and so on, off they went. So one of the groups of Crows went on the train all the way to Carlisle. Some had previous, yes, these were students who had already been in the reservation boarding school. And the journey to Carlisle went to Iowa, then Chicago, then Pennsylvania. And from the station, when they got in Carlisle, they walked for 2 miles. Carlisle is a retired Army base, and that is where he got permission to have the school. Now, there were 10,606 students who came to Carlisle in its overall institutional life. And in Education for Extinction, there is a list by tribe, how many children. Of course, I'm interested in the C's because I'm Crow and I'm studying the Crows, but it's in alphabetical order and it is a great source of information. Certainly, you probably have an interest on behalf of one tribal nation or another, but you can see here, Caddo 41, Cherokee 300, let's see, no, I want to try to use this, okay. Cherokee 370, and there were certain tribes that were around that northeast area they would not serve because it was too close. They wanted to be further away. They're Choctaw 82, Chippewa. This would be from the Great Lakes region, 998. Hallville 23, Cree just 1. Let's see, Comanche, and then of Crow 997. All right. So of the 10,600 Indian students who attended Carlisle, 758 of them graduated. There were students who ran away. It just could not stand it. Imagine running away in Pennsylvania to try to get home all the way to wherever you're from. And the others completed schooling but lived with stress and disturbance for the rest of their lives. Students at Carlisle, by and large, were older, however, and many did make lifelong friendships and, of course, sports. We heard Christy mentioned about the sports, the athletics. Over the 40 years of school existence, there were changes in program elements because most of the Carlisle students went straight home. It really irked Pratt to no end that the students packed up and went home. He had the idea that they would be assimilated and go off into American mainstream society, never to be heard from again. But they went home. So there was some change of the curriculum and more of a focus on skills for self-sufficiency, the ability to live on the reservation rather than assimilated into the white society. Also, another factor is that Carlisle was very accessible to Washington, D.C. You know, distances are pretty small over there on that end of the country, and leaders came there all the time. And Pratt was always interested in parading, you know, his students in front of the leaders. Now, where are voices of the students who went? Well, there's two very well-documented writers who are both Lakotas. Luther Standing Bear, a Dakota, he went to a boarding school. The fact is that we were being transformed, and short hair being the mark of gentility with the white men, he put upon us the mark. It hurt my feelings to such an extent that tears came into my eyes. And none of us slept well that night. We felt so queer the night before the day they got their hair cut. He said, I wanted to feel my head all the time the night before hair cutting. Cutting off of hair for me was associated with mourning the dead. An older boy at Carlisle cut his own hair, and all the girls and boys began a shrill wailing, an eerie, unsettling sound. A young lady who went to a boarding school, she went to a Quaker school. She didn't go to a federal school, but you know that more than half of the boarding schools were funded with and alongside religious organizations. Remember the Christianization aim. They're very much interwoven. You can't just say, oh, this is a federal school, because there was so much interaction between and among Christian denomination. Her name is Sitkala Sash, a Yankton Lakota, attended a Quaker boarding school at age 12. On the first day, a large bell rang for breakfast, its loud metallic voice crashing through the belfry overheard and into our sensitive ears. The annoying clatter of shoes on bare floors gave us no peace. The constant clash of harsh noises with an undercurrent of many voices murmuring to us in an unknown language made a bedlam within which I was securely tied. And though my spirit tore itself in struggling for its lost freedom, all was useless. She says, once I lost a dear classmate. I remember how well she used to mope along at my side until one morning she could not raise her head from her pillow. At her deathbed, I stood weeping as the pale-faced woman sat near her, moistening the dry lips. And this is from Sitkala Sah's own book, American Indian Stories, Legends, and Other Writings. Yes, there were health problems. In this time in Native America, there was an incredible amount of disease and illness. And so, well, we'll get to that just to the extent. Okay. Now, who recruited for these schools? I'll just touch on this one briefly. It was the local agent that decided who would be brought to the off-reservation school. The agent had all control. And there were some agents who chose the troublemakers to send off to Carlisle or Chemawa or Haskell or Fort Shaw. Or there were some agents that didn't choose anybody. They didn't participate in the program. It was an entire judgment call on behalf of those agents. However, education was compulsory, as we've already said. Regulation dress, yes, uniforms. They changed the students from tribal clothing, and it was taken and destroyed. And on the left here are Crow male students from 1890. Me, I want to look at the photos. I want to see the faces, because it's not a count of numbers. These are individual people, members of our families, our relatives. And I just want to know those faces. So their individuality in the way that they came dressed was completely stripped away. They were made into white man carbon copies. Their uniforms met school regulations, and boys had 2 plain suits, extra pair of trousers, and girls had 3 dresses. And my grandpa said the worst thing was everything was wool, including their undergarments. He said, I always had rash. Everything was awful. And when I sweat, it made it worse. Off-reservation schools had better clothes. Carlisle had red shoulder stripes on the boys' uniforms, and Carlisle girls had cloaks with red braid. Some ruffles and lace were allowed. And then reservation school children often got oversized boots, beaten up hats, uncomfortable in woolen underwear. Carlisle was really famous for the before and after pictures. So before you're a heathen, after you're a civilized man. And I really despise that, so you're not going to see one of those. That's editorializing to the max. But he did use photography. He took pictures of every single individual student and in groups. And all the photography was part of the public relations in order for him to get the appropriations that he needed and the support from various philanthropic groups. So what is the curriculum at Carlisle? Pratt and the teacher's goal was to prepare American Indian students to work in the mainstream. They studied English, math, geography, music, the boys' industrial skills like furniture building, woodworking, working with iron, tin, steel. One of our Crow young men is a tinsmith from his studies at Carlisle. Girls, home skills for cooking, doing laundry, baking, and caretaking skills. Carlisle's intercollegiate activities are probably most well known to all of us because of Jim Thorpe. The sports teams played football and basketball and ran track. They even competed in the Summer Olympics in 1912. But they had debate clubs, literary clubs, drama clubs, marching bands, and Carlisle Marching Band was in every presidential inauguration parade. Also, that went with the curriculum was what was called the outing system, where each and every individual student by trade was placed out in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey to live with a white family and practice being white, basically. I mean, they would be alongside the family. If they were there for 6 months or even a year, they would actually go to public school. Or they would be working in the family business or the family farm or dairy. So the outing, Carlisle students lived and worked in outing placements, and the grand majority of these placements were with Quaker families. I got a letter from a Quaker family who said their great-great-grandparents had housed one of the Crow Indian students that had been at Carlisle. I thought that was really cool. One of those amazing connections, you know. So the outing families did give a nominal wage to the students for their work. Carlisle students had to speak English and hold jobs to earn money while they were on outing placements. Oh, this is about leadership changes. I think we'll go on. Here we're going to see some of what Carlisle looked like. This is the seal, you might say, or the logo of Carlisle up there in the left, the main gate to Carlisle Indian School. Yes, they took over already a hugely well-established, beautiful Army base. I just had the chance to visit there in June, and it is just an amazing place, huge, really. And the Carlisle Indian vocational shops, yes, our Captain Pratt did build a number of buildings for the purposes of school, and one of them was the vocational shops. Now, in the tour that I took of Carlisle, we were asking who gives the tours of Carlisle. There's a voluntary group of Native people from this immediate region who have a rotating schedule, and they tour people through Carlisle Indian School. And in about 98 or so, they found that there was no signage whatsoever. So this sign was established by that group of volunteers. And I'm sorry, you probably in the back can't read it, but I'll quickly read it to you here. This school was the model for a nationwide system of boarding schools intended to assimilate American Indians into mainstream culture. Over 10,000 indigenous children attended the school between 1879 and 1918. Despite idealistic beginnings, the school left a mixed and lasting legacy, creating opportunity for some students and conflicted identities for others. In this cemetery, this is a sign by the cemetery. In this cemetery, there are 138 graves of students who died while at Carlisle. That's one of the more dramatic signs that I saw there on the campus of Carlisle. This is a map of all of the buildings. Carlisle Barracks was in good condition when the school opened. Students lived in the north end. Teachers, staff, and the superintendent lived on the southern side near the entrance. In the early 1880s, the American Indian students and the white staff expanded the school campus by building a chapel, a dining hall, classroom buildings, girls' dormitory, a warehouse, boiler house, laundry, hospital, printing shop, art studio, and cemetery. They also added a 6-foot fence around the perimeter of the campus. So here are some interior views of classrooms. At Carlisle, a half a day was for academics and the other half day was for devoted to vocational shops. So this is a classroom, and if you could get up real close and personal, on the board it says current events. And it's hard to read the writing. I'd like to know what exactly current events they might have been studying there. Carlisle students, and I talked about the outings, and you can see this is a classroom at Carlisle Indian School in 1900. The dining hall, very regimented. They sat in assigned seats and they had very specific, sort of manners that had to be carried out. And then we have the harness making shop, the sewing shop. Certainly all young ladies were there, and they made almost all of their dresses right there at Carlisle. Carlisle Indian Domestic Science Classroom, they're probably learning cooking. And they had an enormous band, and I mentioned the band before that played in the presidential inaugural parades. They struggled with student illness and death. Using archival material, government reports, and newspapers, this author, Preston McBride, if you're interested in health at Carlisle, wrote Boarding Schools, Rethinking Mortalities at Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Enrollment, desertion, sickness, and mortality figures indicate that Carlisle exhibited extremely high death rates in comparison with other comparable demographic units like other colleges or schools. The diseases that troubled the students who came were measles, mumps, trachoma, tuberculosis especially. In fact, Carlisle built a hospital specifically to treat the tubercular victims in the student population, and the overall devastating their immune systems. Now, there's an historian, Barbara Landis, who documents 192 deaths at Carlisle, and Genevieve Bell, who actually lives right there at Carlisle, one of the scholars that I talked to you about, asserted 227 had died. And a hospital was built on campus in 1887, and a replacement hospital with an emphasis on TB treatment. One of the most compelling buildings in the whole campus is the jail. Now, this is a jail that actually had been there for the military, but it was used. It was used for the Carlisle students. And one of the narratives in the Department of Interior report is that the punishments were severe and numerous and often had little or nothing to do with the severity of the infringement. Looking down into that jail, that's where I really pulled at my for sure, heartstrings. I could just imagine somebody down there in isolation. And so then there's a hall that was built by the students for physical training, and physical training was something both boys and girls were involved with every single day. This is a building you can walk in and just imagine Jim Thorpe. He was part of the first class that used, he actually helped build it, and then he worked out for the Olympics in this building. Of course, I would say that the small museum that's on campus devotes about 50% of their display to Jim Thorpe, which is sort of a, one of those deals. Let's divert your attention, shall we? Now I'm going to turn to the research I've done on the Crow students who went to Carlisle. And there is a digital database that is housed at Dickinson State College there in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And they have digitized all the student records, all the school records, and they're very, very searchable. So it's called the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center. Now you can search it by tribe, you can search it by individual name, and really it's very, very good. It's very well organized. My questions were, how many Crow students went to Carlisle? Because when I started, I had no idea. I knew families. I had about 35 names of people I thought had gone to Carlisle, but I didn't know. And so my search was, what are the names? Who are those students? What were their ages when they went to Carlisle? And what fields did they study when they were there? Why did the students leave? So those were the questions that I started out, as a researcher. Well, lots of other things pop up. One thing leads to another. So I identified Crow student information in student files. It's organized by everything on a particular student is in a file. So if you get that far, you might find one slip of paper in that file, digital, of course, or on the contrast, there was one file that had 38 pages of material, even a letter from my great-grandmother sending her son to Carlisle and telling all the reasons why she wanted him to go. I got to see my great-grandmother's handwriting. That was one of the more thrilling moments there. So student files. And there's advanced student files for things like, did they join clubs? Were they in sports? Did they write in the newspaper? Were they performers? And so on. Images, lots of images. Many are unidentified, but many are identified. And so if you're into images, you're just going to get piles and piles of images. Publications, documents, lists and ledgers, teaching resources, cemetery information, and so on. So this is what it'll look like if you open that site. So now we're going to look at, and I just need to tell you that in the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty did have a provision for education signed with the Crow tribe, July 25th, it was ratified of 1868. In order to ensure the civilization of Indians entering into this treaty, the necessity of education is admitted, especially of such of them as are or may be settled on said agricultural reservations. And they therefore pledge themselves to compel their children, compel is the big word there, their children, male and female, between the ages of 6 and 16, to attend school. And it is hereby made the duty of the agent, that's the man in charge, the agent, to see that this stipulation is strictly complied with. Now, these are simple words, but this meant sending the police out every fall to get the children who hadn't already been rounded up the previous fall, or to find those who ran away from school and bring them back. Now, on the Crow Reservation, here are the schools, and there are quite a few. And we, of course, are looking at Carlisle, but I thought you might want to see, where have these children been in school before? And they all had all of the students that I looked at. So all these schools are grades 1 through 6. Crow Agency Boarding School has a capacity of up to 150 students. Montana Industrial School, which was operated by the Unitarian Church in the northern part of our reservation up here, which is now not on the reservation any longer, called the Montana Industrial School, wasn't open but 11 years. Prior boarding school on the west end of our reservation, right here, on Pryor Creek, and Billings is just 9 miles from our boundary right there. See, Billings is peeking out from there. And then Baptist Day, let's see, St. Xavier Catholic Boarding School, the largest Catholic boarding school, still operating. And then in Lodge Grass, we had a Baptist Day School, which is a story for another time. We don't have time to talk about. It's actually my favorite story. Anyway, so no, I can't. It'll take too much time and it'll get in the way. I get distracted and I've got to be careful. Okay, so education and health. Now, it's really, really important to think about where these tribal nations have been leading right up to this day, when non-reservation schools are now, they're rounding up children for these schools. Because we have tribes whose population has collapsed due to war or disease, some of them by 90%. As we recruit children for Carlisle from Crow, and this is what this is about, the health conditions on the bottom there during the decades 1890 to 1920. The Crow tribe population went from 2,500. Now, that's not a very big place. That's a pretty small town in Montana, isn't it? 2,500. And this is after all smallpox has hit a dozen times since about 1720. Every time smallpox hit the Crow, about half the people died. So it's like half. And now, in this moment in time, we have 2,500. And then by 1920, the population was down to 1,800 individuals. Due to smallpox, tuberculosis, whooping cough, respiratory and gastric conditions, and malnutrition. And now we're going to take your children away from you. Can you imagine how that must feel? I can't. I can't even imagine somebody I don't know taking my kids from me. But I can't imagine the destitution that we find our people in at this moment. All right, so I want you to know that our children are beautiful. When they were ready or taken, when those policemen came around, these are Crow Indian girls in 1927, but they're still very much traditionally dressed. Max Big Man and his sons down here in the lower left. And this is a Crow Indian family in 1910. Our family units are very, very strong, very precious, very highly valued. Some little kids with their precious dresses playing on a pole. Wouldn't you love to play with them? Okay, we're going to now start about the Crow Indian students. And so there are 96 that I managed to locate in all of the lists. And so in 96 Crow Indian students went to Carlisle from 1883 to 1918. And before we look at the data, this is a photo of Crow Indian male students in 1890. Now the school opened in 79, sorry, transposing there. But we did not send, Crow agents didn't send any students. I'll say we, I'll go ahead and claim the agent, but they didn't send Crow students till 1883. So this is a photo from 1890. It's from the National Anthropological Archives Smithsonian Institution photo. So there were 58 males and 38 females. Okay, more males than females. And I was interested in their age. Age at entry is on an enrollment card, and I'll show you some examples of that. The youngest was 7 years old, but just one. The next one, a 9-year-old, another, just one, and a 10-year-old, two. And then you see those in blue. This is the age of most of the students, age 12 through 18. So groups. Our agent, the agent at Crow, sent them in groups. But this is 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 8, 14-year-olds, 13. So yes, they had already been to boarding school. You might say the shock of boarding school had already occurred with those children. Well, now they're further away from home. There's probably other sources of, trouble and shock. So our agent set groups of students entering Carlisle. In 83, sent 19. And 83, we were still at our second agency over by Absaroka, Montana. So the agent there packed up kids and sent them. That was interesting. Okay, in 1888, 24 students. In 1890, 19. 1898, 9. 1906, 4. 1908, 6. Okay, and students who entered Carlisle had anywhere from 24 months in school all the way up to 72 months. And that's on the in admitting card. And they were in lots of different trades. Oh, shoot. Sorry. All right. So they were in many different trades. I also noticed in the student files that students were discharged for illness. There were 17 of those 96 who were sent home because they were so ill. Now, Carlisle actually had a policy. We don't want them to die here. We want to send them home. So they get them on the train and they'd send them home when they were worsening and worsening. So, 10,000 students and just 180 per, I say just, but the number is 180 some or 90 or maybe over 200 died. The reason is because their policy was send them home. And actually a lot of boarding schools had that policy. They didn't want them to die there. So now, how many Crow Indians graduated? This would be like a high school diploma at that time. Lots of education, way more than probably people in Montana had at that time. These are our graduates. First of all, this picture is, oh, shoot, I did it again, sorry. Okay. This graduating class is from 1897, and we have two tribal members. One is Alexander Upshaw, right there, Alexander Upshaw and Frank Shively. And they're in that class. And of all those 96 students, we have graduates, George Means, Carl Leader, George Suis, Louisa Giesdorf, William Layton, Joseph Martinez, Frank Shively, Alexander Upshaw, Charlotte Giesdorf, Rose LaForge, George Washington Hogan, Christine Childs. And one of the things that they like to do in the boarding schools, especially at the grades K through 6, they gave them patriotic names. Now this young man's name is George Washington Hogan. And then we have a guy who's named Thomas Jefferson from the Crow boarding school, and their family has given all their names like Truman Jefferson, the names of presidents. Okay, so now from here, I actually have a spreadsheet of all the students. And if you're a student or a person who does all of this kind of digging down into the records, I began to list commonalities, common things about the students or unusual, like the Katie Adams. Oh, wow. Oh, I apologize. I'm overly excited. You guys are getting me pretty worked up here. Sorry. Katie Adams died at Carlisle. She's one of 3 students who died there. Katie Adams. Here we have Beatrice Beads on Ankle, who left due to marriage. If you got married, you were kicked out. Yeah, but you can see there's ill health. Times expired. Now that is because when a student went to Carlisle, they got 5 years to be there. And they had to make, if they didn't graduate, then they'd probably be sent home. So, and I wish this was so that you could oh, what does this mean? And so on. But I just want you to see the sort of data that you can get from this digital archives among all these students. So I will point out my grandpa's brother, George Pease. And that's where in his file, I found a letter from my great-grandmother, his mother, saying all the reasons why George should go to school at Carlisle. And by 1898 or so, you had to have parental permission to go to Carlisle. So it was really thrilling to see George Pease in this list, of course, but he went there when he was 18. And they let him in. So he was there from 15 to 18, and he earned 4 vocational certificates. Now, how close is this touch-in? Yes, it's my grandpa's brother, but his youngest son is still alive and calls me all the time. He's 93. We can talk about his experiences at Carlisle. He was there when the flu epidemic hit, and he was assigned to the mortuary, and it was very unpleasant duty. Then they sent him and transferred him to Chemawa out in Oregon, and he did the same thing. He was the mortician there. Lots more to that story. Anyway, okay. So you can see there's lots of information now. Here are some wonderful photos. Frank Yarlett and George Pratt, they had friends. And the students would hire up the photographer if they saved their money from their earnings, and they'd go over and buy pictures from the on-campus photographer that Pratt had. So this fellow is Dick Wallace, and he's a distant relative of mine, 1888. And this is Frank and Maggie Kaiser. Oftentimes we find siblings as well. And here's a few more: Helen Onion, Hugh Leader, and we have John Morrison, Martin Roundface, and James Waldy, who was a Kiowa. So they had made friends. Now, these are the students that got very, very ill. And when I first looked at dismissed or discharged due to illness, I thought, oh, they're not long of this world. But then I got into agency records and letters from the agent and so on like that. And I realized I was able to find out that 6 of these 17 recovered. They didn't all die. Lillian Otter Chief, I'll just read a few of their names. Charles Bravo. Charles Clausen recovered. Samuel Davis recovered. Kills with his brother. Her name was Tilly. She recovered. But Sarah Shavings deceased in 1899. George Suis. Now, this is a personal one. My grandmother actually married George Suis. George Suis came back from Carlisle. He had been sent to teachers' college. And so he was a man with future. And my grandmother married him. And unfortunately, he came home with tuberculosis and he died. And so my grandmother moved on with her life. But that's an interesting factor right there. A few more faces here. Very important. Persis Big Hair. Richard Sanderville and William Layton, Joe Stewart, Albert Anderson, and Theron Lears. So who are the students who died at Carlisle? Yeah, that was a mystery I wanted to solve. Charles Fisher from Crow Agency. He was enrolled from 83 to 86. He's in plot location A133. And if you go to Carlisle, you have to get clearance. You have to apply a number of days. I think it's 30 days ahead of time. I was actually cleared, although I've been something of a controversial person in my life. I was with a group of Kiowas, Crows, and yes, an intertribal group. And there was one person who did not get approved, and she just had to stay in the bus. I didn't know why. We didn't know why, but we went ahead to tour. And then so Katie Helen Adams from St. X, age 20, enrolled from 00 to 3. Her trade was housework, and she died from tuberculosis. And the third one is Ernest Iron. Now, this was one of the very big mysteries of the records, because when I looked at it, okay, he was enrolled from 08 to 10. And the student died on the same day that he was discharged. And I thought, what was that? Why did that happen? And so when I went to Carlisle, we dug into the county, 2 minutes. Oh, okay. We dug into the county records, and it turns out that the death certificate on this Ernest Iron said that he was buried in Crow Agency. Now, the story, and there's even more at the archives there in Dickinson, the story is that Carlisle sent for the parents because he was alive, but yet he was very ill. They managed to get on the train and get all the way out to Carlisle. And we don't know, actually, from what records we could see, whether he died there and they took his body home, or they took him very ill, got him on the train, and he died on the way. But we found his grave in the St. Xavier Cemetery. So there's 2, not 3, and the third mystery is now solved. That's pretty interesting. So 2 minutes left, huh? Shoot. Anyway, yes, students got married there, and they met their, we have a very wonderful family named Dillons. Rosa LaForge married Charles Dillon, very large family there. Julia Hawks married Thomas Medicine Horse, and they're from other tribes. Well, I will conclude by saying that it has been quite an adventure, realizing student files and then bringing all of it together to make what I think is certainly a narrative, a story of our youth. And many of these Carlisle students got very sick. 3 died. And there are others who made very, very important lives for themselves and their families upon their return. All of them returned to Crow Agency. So just what Pratt didn't want, they all returned. They all came home. Well, thank you very much for listening to me.